How long has it been since you climbed a tree? Well, it was a lot easier when I was a kid than it is now, but today I'm determined to climb a tree. I'm only 60 years old. What could go wrong? You know, climbing a tree with tennis shoes and shorts on is a lot easier than it would have been to climb a tree wearing sandals and a robe. The real question is not if you can still climb a tree, of course. The real important question is, who would you be willing to climb a tree for? This morning we'll be studying about a man who was willing and able to climb a tree. He's been immortalized in song as a wee little man, but in Scripture he's better known as Zacchaeus, a wealthy tax collector. Come join us for Class on the Hill this morning as we study about how this man met Jesus and what happened in his life.
Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. He climbed up in a sycamore tree for the Lord he wanted to see.
Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, or good evening, whatever the case may be. Welcome back to Class on the Hill. It's great to have you in class with us again. If this is your first time with us, we're glad to have you join us. And if you came back, well, thank you very much. This is our 5th MackTalk. Basically, a MackTalk is longer than a TED Talk, shorter than a Spencer Talk, but still not as good as either one. So let's see, our first 4 lessons. Can you remember what they were about? First lesson, the baptism of Jesus. Second lesson, the temptations of Jesus. The next lesson, Jesus calls his first disciples at the Sea of Galilee. And then last week we talked about Jesus at the temple. Today's lesson will be a short lesson. You might even say a wee little lesson. Now, next week's lesson, you want to be here for it. It will be our most important one. And I hope you'll join us for it. Meanwhile, today we'll begin in Luke chapter 19. Now, as you're turning there, maybe we'll start with a little quiz about a wee little man. Question number 1. Who were the 2 tax collectors named in the Gospels? Number 2. What kind of tree did one of them climb? Number 3. What city was Jesus passing through when he ran into Zacchaeus? Number 4. Which Gospels tell the story of Zacchaeus? And number 5. What's another name for a tax collector? Okay, so we kind of gave away one of the names, but you got that anyway. The names of the 2 tax collectors named in the Gospels, of course, are Zacchaeus and Matthew. What kind of tree did Zacchaeus climb? Okay, the song says it was a sycamore tree, but apparently it may have been more technically a sycamore fig tree. What city was Jesus passing through when he ran into Zacchaeus? All right, bonus points if you got this one. That's a little tougher. He was on his way to Jericho, or going through Jericho on his way to Jerusalem. And which Gospels tell this story? Only Luke tells the story of Zacchaeus. And another name for a tax collector is a publican. Well, I love it when a song tells a story, like a ballad, like Edmund Fitzgerald. Well, you got to kind of go back for that one. Who did that one? Was that Gordon Lightfoot? And then there was the Battle of New Orleans, one of my favorites, Johnny Horton. Now, those are pretty good, but how about the Ballad of Zacchaeus? It's really pretty accurate when you think about the song. Zacchaeus was a wee little man, and a wee little man was he. Okay, now, there might have been a bit too much emphasis on him being a wee little man, because he wasn't that little. But the song itself is really quite good and kind of tells the story. So let's look at the story in Luke chapter 19, verse 1. Jesus entered Jericho and was passing through. A man was there by the name of Zacchaeus. He was a chief tax collector and was wealthy. He wanted to see who Jesus was, but being a short man, he could not because of the crowd. So he ran ahead and climbed a sycamore fig tree to see him, since Jesus was coming that way. When Jesus reached the spot, he looked up and said to him, Zacchaeus, come down immediately. I must stay at your house today. So he came down at once and welcomed him gladly. All the people saw this and began to mutter, "He is gone to be the guest of a sinner." But Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, "Look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay them back 4 times the amount." Jesus said to him, "Today salvation has come to this house, because this man too is a son of Abraham. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost." Now, just what does a sycamore tree look like, or a sycamore fig tree? I don't know exactly what they look like. A sycamore tree in America may look a little bit different than the sycamore fig tree of the Middle East, but apparently the trees itself are climbable. Zacchaeus was able to climb this tree. Jesus was really on his way to Jerusalem. It's just about the last week of his life. He's about to enter Jerusalem for the last time, and he's passing through Jericho, a city which is about 17 miles away from Jerusalem. And there he was met by Zacchaeus, a chief Roman tax collector. Jericho, the city itself, was a very large city. About 100,000 people lived in the city back in the day of Jesus. It was a beautiful city, known for its palm trees, sometimes called the City of Palms. It was known for the palm trees and rose gardens. The streets were lined with sycamore trees, or sycamore fig trees, and Jericho was a wealthy city, a center of trade. All goods passing through were subject to taxation. Today, Jericho still exists. It's located in the disputed West Bank region of Israel. Many consider it to possibly be the oldest or one of the oldest cities in the world itself. So, tax collectors worked for the Romans and were thus looked down upon by the Jews. Zacchaeus himself was a Jew working for the Romans and becoming rich off of his own people. The tax collectors collected what was required, and everything above this was theirs to keep. And as a chief tax collector, he had others working for him. Zacchaeus was therefore essentially at the top of his profession. Verse 2 says, and he was wealthy. Some versions say, and he was rich. Now, even though he was a rich man, Zacchaeus apparently was not happy. He was an outcast from his own people. He was finding that money did not bring happiness in his life. Something was missing. Even though he was rich, he felt the need for something else. Things were not making him happy. Now, tax collectors in the Jewish realm were not allowed to vote in Jewish elections. They were not allowed to testify in Jewish courts, nor were they allowed to attend the synagogues. They were essentially cast-outs from the Jewish society. We look back to Luke 18:11 for just a moment. We get a little glimpse into how they were regarded. Luke 18:11, Jesus is telling the story of 2 men who went to pray. 2 men went up to pray at the temple, one a Pharisee and the other a tax collector. The Pharisee stood up and prayed about himself, God, I thank you, I am not like other men, robbers, evildoers, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week and give 1/10 of all I get. But the tax collector stood at a distance. He would not even look up to heaven, but beat his breast and said, God, have mercy on me, a sinner. It's interesting that these two Jesus brings together in a story that may have been a parable. The ending of it, Jesus says, I tell you that this man rather than the other went home justified before God. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Jesus certainly had already pulled in Matthew as a follower, as a special disciple of his, and he was a tax collector. And it might be that some of the tax collectors had a bad reputation without necessarily stealing from the people. But because they were taking taxes, automatically there was a strike against them. The story doesn't really say that Zacchaeus stole money from the people. He was a tax collector, and he may have been, and he certainly was wealthy. The story itself doesn't say that he took money above what he was supposed to take. Tax collectors were regarded in general as thieves of the people, Thus, they weren't accepted by the people. They weren't even allowed to attend the synagogue. They were considered sinful, and they weren't welcome into the homes of who were considered to be the decent Jewish people. Financial success, however, Zacchaeus found did not bring fulfillment. He was looking for something more. Now, when you think about the fact that Matthew was a tax collector, is it possible that Matthew and Zacchaeus already knew each other? Is it possible that Zacchaeus had heard something about Jesus, either from seeing Jesus speak somewhere or some connection with Matthew? Sometimes spiritual, religious people isolate themselves from the sinful people. Thus, the sinful people are alienated from the people they need to help bring them to God. Zacchaeus must have been a wee little man. Let's think about, at least what I read is that 2,000 years ago, the average height of a man was 5 feet tall. He must have been less than 5 feet tall, most likely. Now, Zacchaeus was unable to see Jesus because of his physical stature. And perhaps you've been in a crowd, maybe at a ball game. You're trying to see over the people who are in front of you. Sometimes it's just difficult to see when taller people are sitting or standing in front of you. But Zacchaeus could have given up, and he did not. He ran ahead and climbed up a tree so that he could see Jesus passing by. He shows us that we shouldn't give up in trying to become closer to Jesus. Because our first efforts have failed, keep trying. Sometimes it takes work, like climbing a tree. Okay, now let's think about this for a minute. For a child, for a youngster, climbing a tree is not so hard, not so difficult. But the older we get, the more difficult it is to climb those trees. And in particular, we think about the fact that he was probably wearing a robe, probably wearing sandals. I just don't think that makes it any easier to climb a tree. So Jesus passes by. He looks up in the tree and he sees Zacchaeus. He certainly did not make fun of him. He could have said something about making a wisecrack about a short thief in the tree. But Jesus told Zacchaeus kind of the opposite. He said, "Come down quickly, for I'm coming to your house today." How did Jesus know Zacchaeus' name anyway? There's at least a few possibilities. Maybe it was miraculous. Maybe Jesus had never met him and he just knew because he's Jesus. Or maybe Zacchaeus was so well known in those parts. Maybe he was a notorious tax collector and his name was well known. Or maybe at the point that Jesus stopped and looked up in the tree, the crowd saw Zacchaeus. The crowds knew who Zacchaeus was. Crowds could have been calling out his name, maybe even making fun of him, at the same time that Jesus was inviting himself to the house of Zacchaeus. Now let's just think about what Zacchaeus did. When Jesus invites himself to his house, Zacchaeus did not hesitate at all. He was hurrying to make sure that he was going to be there and ready. He didn't back away. He didn't make excuses for his house. He didn't say, "Oh, my house isn't clean. Could you come back tomorrow? Give me a couple of hours." He hurried to make Jesus welcome and received Jesus gladly. Meanwhile, it says all the people around grumbled, possibly including Jesus' own disciples, because after all, here is a tax collector that Jesus is befriending at this point. It's interesting to me that Jesus is approaching the last 7 days of his life. When he's passing through Jericho, he's busy. He knows he has a short amount of time left. What would you do if you had a short amount of time left? Would you take some extra time to spend it with a stranger that you never met and go to their house? Jesus himself is finding that to be of great importance, to go to this man's house and have a conversation with him because he knows this is the opportunity to bring in another one of the lost sheep of Israel. The people grumbled. While they would not offer salvation to him, the Jews wouldn't offer acceptance to him, Jesus would accept him. Jesus accepted people who were outcasts. Just think, there's different kind of outcasts. There's outcasts spiritually, there's outcasts socially, there's outcasts physically. And Jesus was willing to accept Zacchaeus, a man who was left out from the society of his own people. Remember, these are the last days of Jesus' life, and he's spending time while he has maybe some unfinished business to take care of, this is the thing that Jesus does with the last bit of time that he has. The original language of the text says, and standing, Zacchaeus rose to his feet. Well, Zacchaeus is bringing attention. It's interesting to me that the passage goes immediately from Jesus in the streets talking to Zacchaeus in the tree, and suddenly they're at the house. They don't give us any time passage. How long did it take to get there? But the next thing you know, they go from the tree to the house, and it says in verse 8, but Zacchaeus stood up and said to the Lord, look, Lord, here and now I give half of my possessions to the poor, and if I have cheated anybody out of anything, I will pay back 4 times the amount. Zacchaeus announced a commitment to give half of his possessions to the poor and give back 4 times as much to those he may have stolen from or defrauded. Now, this kind of indicates that Zacchaeus knew the old law, because if you go back to Exodus, the law of Moses tells us what the penalty is for stealing. This is from Exodus chapter 22. I'm going to read a few different verses, 1, 4, 7, and 9. If a man steals an ox or a sheep and slaughters it or sells it, he must pay back 5 head of cattle for this ox and 4 sheep for the sheep. Verse 4 says, if the stolen animal is found alive in his possession, whether ox or donkey or sheep, he must pay back double. Verse 7 says, if a man gives his neighbor silver or goods for safekeeping and they are stolen from the neighbor's house, the thief, if he is caught, must pay back double. And then in verse 9, it says, in all cases of illegal possession of an ox, a donkey, a sheep, a garment, or any other lost property about which somebody says, this is mine, both parties are to bring their cases before the judges. The one whom the judges declare guilty must pay back double to his neighbor. Okay, so sometimes it's twice, maybe sometimes it's 4 times. Zacchaeus knew something of this, I think. Zacchaeus is showing actions worthy of repentance. Things that he's done wrong, he's not just saying, I'm going to change. He's saying, I'm going to change and try to make things right from the past. To me, it makes me think that perhaps Zacchaeus has not just heard Jesus. Perhaps he even had heard John the Baptist speaking. Do you remember that John the Baptist spoke specifically to tax collectors? I'm going to look back to Luke chapter 3 for a moment. This is from one of the sermons that we have included from John the Baptist, Luke chapter 3, verse 8. Produce fruit in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, out of these stones, God can raise up children for Abraham. And skipping down to verse 12, tax collectors also came to be baptized. Teacher, they asked, what should we do? Don't collect any more than you are required to, he told them. It's interesting, there's a specific address from John the Baptist to the tax collectors about what they should and shouldn't do. He didn't tell them to quit collecting taxes. He just said, don't take more than what you're supposed to do. For Zacchaeus, we see that he's making a change, even though it cost him something. At this point, his riches were not his priority. I'm going to skip ahead a little bit. This is not in the Scriptures, but this is in some historical text. Clement of Alexandria wrote that Zacchaeus later became an elder of the church in Caesarea. It's not in the Bible. It's a tradition. It might be true, and it might not be true. But at least there's a story to that effect of what might have happened with Zacchaeus later on. We don't know what all Jesus said to Zacchaeus. There's a whole talk between them over supper. I wish Luke had included some of that talk. But the end of the talk is what we do have, I think. Zacchaeus is ready to change after he's met Jesus around the table. Jesus announces his purpose really at the end of this exchange. He says, today salvation has come to this house because this man too is a son of Abraham. It's interesting that the Jews couldn't accept him as a son of Abraham, but Jesus could. For the Son of Man came to seek and to save what was lost, Jesus said. That was really Jesus' purpose, to seek and to save that which was lost, to diligently search for, to diligently search for the lost, those that were out of place, you might say. Remember, Jesus gave 3 parables? You remember where they were about something that was lost? Luke chapter 15. Do you remember what 3 things were lost? The lost coin, the lost sheep, and the lost son, the prodigal son. Jesus was still fulfilling his purpose, still working to the last days of his life. Interesting story I heard. Those of you interested in space exploration, Apollo 13, do you remember the trouble that they had trying to return to the earth? And at the point that they were getting them back, it was critical. They might not have saved them, but they did make it. Okay, so one of the astronauts was interviewed later. What would you have done? They asked, if they had not been able to save you. Of course, they wouldn't have died immediately. It would have meant that they probably would have bounced off the atmosphere and gone off into space and still been alive until their supplies of oxygen ran out. Anyway, his response I thought was quite interesting. He said, we would have continued the mission until we couldn't. I think that's really what Jesus is doing. He's continuing his mission until he couldn't. He's got about a little bit more than a week at this point where he meets Zacchaeus. Well, Jesus saw within Zacchaeus the potential for a changed life. Within the worst of sinners, he was ready to be there to give them the opportunity to change. Zacchaeus announces what he's going to do. He said he's going to give back half of his possessions to the poor. And if I have cheated anybody, I know. Does that mean since I cheated somebody, I will give back? Or does that really mean if I have, just come and tell me, I'll give back to you? Zacchaeus is ready to give back to anybody that he has cheated. I really think that it's possible that Zacchaeus cheated lots of people. I think it is also possible that Zacchaeus may have been more of a follower of the Lord and trying to follow what John the Baptist has said and had not cheated so many people, but he's willing to give back half of his possessions to the poor. Now, I want to set up a little bit of a contrast because the story, one chapter before Luke records the story of Zacchaeus in Luke 19 is the story of the rich young ruler in Luke chapter 18. Remember that Zacchaeus comes to Jesus as a wealthy man who is a sinner and who changes. Luke chapter 18, we have the rich young ruler, a wealthy man who is a good man and who's not really willing to do what Jesus asked him to do and follow him completely. The rich young ruler comes to Jesus hopefully and walks away sadly. Zacchaeus comes to Jesus hopefully and walks away saved, joyfully. Jesus didn't really ask Zacchaeus to give away all of his possessions. Zacchaeus just decides, I'm going to give away half of my possessions and restore fourfold whatever I may have taken from anybody else. After Jesus talked to Zacchaeus, he commits to do this, and he's ready to change his life. I think at this point, the commandment, thou shalt have no other gods before me, really comes into application. The god of money, the god of greed, came in between the rich young ruler and God. He found he couldn't serve 2 masters, and he walked away sadly, continuing to follow the master of his money. But Zacchaeus demonstrated inward change by outward behavior. This is faith with works. So, there we have the story of Zacchaeus, a man who is willing to climb a tree to see Jesus. What would you be willing to do to see Jesus? Would you go to great lengths to see the Savior? Would you, in fact, climb a tree to see Jesus? Zacchaeus did, and it made all the difference in his life. Well, that's all the time we have time for today. Thanks for tuning in. Hope you'll be back with us next week. You know, after all, it will be our most important lesson. So see you next week. Same bat time, same bat channel.